In episode 9 of our podcast, we interviewed Dr. Kevin McPartland, who shares his research about a Kentucky community that was torn apart by violence before the Civil War. He also worked as a graduate associate at the Civil War Governors of Kentucky project, which is managed by the Kentucky Historical Society. In his interview, Kevin talks a lot about his work, and he also talks a lot about the manager of the project, Dr. Charles Welsko. But after we recorded the interview, we realized that you, our listeners, might want to know more about CWGK, as we call it, from Dr. Welsko himself. Hi, I'm Daniel J. Burge, and this is a special addendum episode of Kentucky Chronicles. So before we delve into questions about CWGK and Kevin's article, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your current role at the Kentucky Historical Society?
I am a historian of the 19th century, long 19th century, a Civil War historian. I'm from Pennsylvania, originally did my graduate work, my master's and my PhD at West Virginia University, and now I came to Kentucky after I finished up my grad school on a brief stint in Georgia as a visiting professor to work on and eventually take over running the Civil War Governors of Kentucky Digital Documentary Edition. My technical title now is the Digital Documentary Editor, and I run the Civil War Governors Project and help oversee the Historical Markers Program. So kind of this blend between being an academic historian who does scholarship, but also very public-facing, engaging with communities on the ground, and I think CWGK fits in very nicely into this project, or into that space, right, as something that is academic, but also connects people to documents and resources about the Civil War.
I think the toughest thing for us sometimes explaining your role at the KHS is sort of how does CWGK sort of fit in with everything we're doing, and how does it sort of, operate within the bounds of KHS? So that was one of the reasons we wanted to have you on as a special guest today to kind of give us that background. Yeah. A lot of times when we do these podcasts, we'll just throw out, it's CWGK, or we have this, or we have that. And then we've got to delve more deeply into, what does that actually mean for our listeners? And how do we sort of look at those different things? And how does that work within the confines of the Kentucky Historical Society? So getting back to Kevin's article a bit, it was guest edited by yourself, and you worked with those who have worked as graduate research associates at CWGK. The theme I wanted to pick out, and one thing that we didn't get to in Kevin's discussion, was why did you pick the particular themes of loyalty, fugitivity, and community? Like, how did you decide as you were coming up with this idea that those would be the main themes that we'd be talking about?
Yeah, I think the way to frame that is, I wouldn't say that I came up with those themes. The graduate students themselves, so the Civil War Governors Project has relied for years on the National Historic Publications and Records Commission that supports us to hire graduate students from around the country to do editorial work on the project. So these graduate students in the past have annotated documents. So they will go through and they'll highlight all the people, places, and organizations and write biographies on those. I think Kevin kind of talked about that very briefly. In 2021, as we were kind of coming back not coming back to the office, but as can't say we're stepping out of COVID, but as we were going through our different iterations, right, of dealing with a post-pandemic world, talked with Stephanie Lang, the editor of the Register, about what we could do. 2019, we had done an issue of published a special issue of the Register focused on CWGK that had pulled from historians from across the country, academics who are predominantly tenure-track faculty members, and we wanted to do something that engaged graduate students. So when we reached out to them, we asked them to pick something that either intersected with their research or interests, or in Kevin's case, right, an interesting story that he had come across while doing his work as a graduate student. And so it's less that we pick these themes, right? I said, do what interests you. What's something that will help you with your dissertation or give you a publication or just fit into a question that you have. So I think that fits into what Kevin's work is, right? This idea of community and how people respond to an event. For him, it's the war. It's how did Confederates connect to the nation, and he looks at it mostly through newspapers, right? So I think that's what drove him to the Wadlington case. It's how did these individuals connect? So it was less prescriptive. It was more of, these are the themes that emerge. And I think that speaks to some of the things that show up in the edition. And certainly it's not all of the things. CWGK right now has 10,000 plus documents. Our hope is to get up to around 20,000 documents. These are things that we see that are important, though, in the documents. And so it kind of worked out, right? Kristen's article that talked a little bit about loyalty, Lucas's and Kristen's talked about loyalty and what did it mean to Kentuckians. Rachel and Danielle talked about fugitivity and enslaved individuals who resisted or were caught up in the process of white enslavers arguing over enslaved individuals. Kevin's kind of fits in between, right? All of these are connected to community on the ground. So again, it wasn't so much us saying these are the topics. It was these are the things we want to write about, and in reflecting on it, oh, these are the threads that are pulling together. And I think that speaks to some of the things you can find in the edition. Maybe I had a little bit of hand on the scale, right? I study loyalty and citizenship myself, kind of in my own work outside of KHS. I think that reflects a little bit too, right? Several of the people were from West Virginia, graduate students. Those are questions that they're asking, whether it's about West Virginia or about African Americans in kind of the mid-Atlantic region. So I think these are themes that kind of pop up in the literature, but also are reflected in our archive.
And I think as younger scholars as well, you have that chance to sort of do up-and-coming stuff and things that other scholars are working on, that you can add that sort of Kentucky angle to everything. In your introduction, you gave a line that I really enjoyed because this taught me a lot about how the CWGK functions and sort of the focus that you all have. So I wanted to read this quote. I really enjoyed this. Quote, CWGK's eyes do not rest on the governors themselves. In fact, one might venture to say that the governors are the side characters of the larger project rather than its main actors. And I thought it was a really interesting point because you really see that play out in Kevin's story. I mean, he doesn't really talk about the governor all that much, and he really doesn't sort of tease out those things. So can you elaborate a little bit on that quote and what you meant by that, and why a project that's known as the Civil War Governors of Kentucky doesn't necessarily focus on the governors themselves?
Yeah, I think the thing that it comes down to is that's a nice title from where CWGK emerged. KHS in the past had done work with the University Press of Kentucky, publishing select governors' papers, so printed volumes of 20th century governors. But for the sesquicentennial of the Civil War, the 150th anniversary, a project on the conflict in a divided state like Kentucky demanded something more ambitious, something bigger. And you couldn't do a selection of just a couple hundred documents. Wadlington's case right itself takes up about 100 documents. It's probably the most well-documented case we have. And the only times the governors show up are as the people that are being addressed, right? The letters are being addressed to McGoffin and later James Fisher Robinson or Thomas Bramlett. I think it's actually James Fisher Robinson. I don't think it gets to Bramlett. They're only being addressed, and I think McGoffin has a side note, right, that says commit, like reduce him to life in prison, right, or something along those lines. Those aren't the exact words. So the governors are the lens, right, and the reason the project functions that way is it helps us reorient the state, right? How historians have often looked at Kentucky historiography or literature, right, has always been through Henry Clay or John Crittenden, the Breckinridge family, right? It's this hagiography, these influential individuals who dominated. If you wanted to think of the Civil War, you can think of John Hunt Morgan, Edward Hobson, individuals who have attracted attention. The animating purpose behind the Civil War Governors Project before I came to KHS was how do we capture the lives of ordinary people in the throes of civil war. The governors sit at the intersection of all of these major concerns that play out in the war. Fugitivity, they go back to those themes. Community, what is happening to people on the ground. Loyalty, right, has a state that divides, as a slaveholding border state. There are a large number of people who go for the Union and support the Union in Kentucky, and a minority that support the Confederacy. But the state is still divided. It has a provisional Confederate government, if briefly, in Bowling Green. But what about the destruction of slavery? What about the mobilization of military forces? What about the advent of guerrilla violence that plagues the state during and after the war? And Wadlington, right, connects to a lot of these things. As Kevin shows off really well, it connects to community. There's one letter in the Wadlington case that talks about this guerrilla violence or regulator violence that plagues Western Kentucky even before the Civil War, that Wadlington, a lot of people assume he's guilty just because of previous examples of regulator violence, of individuals who go and enforce oh wow, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of like spurious justice, right? Rather than taking them to a trial, they execute the individual. There's a case that also shows up in CWGK that I wrote about in an edited volume involving an enslaved man, Wesley, from Caldwell County, who kills a white man at the behest of his owner. That owner is lynched or is executed in the summer of 1859, just a few months before Wadlington kills Milton Cartwright. By looking at the governors, we're able to capture more things on the ground. We're able to capture how ordinary people are experiencing and reacting to the Civil War, and therefore the governors are the lens. Things that are crossing their desk show up, but they themselves are in many cases not the main actor.
No, that's a good way to look at it. I think for me, coming from sort of the outside of the Civil War perspective, it is a really good way to get at all of these issues, because sometimes you do tend to just focus on, okay, here's what politician won an election, or here's someone who did something really major. And I think that's what I enjoyed about Kevin's talk as well, was he really gave us a sense in his article, okay, here's issues that are ongoing, here's how we see community, here are these issues that are ongoing in this era that maybe are buried a bit by the Civil War, and you kind of can overlook them, but they're still individuals living their lives, and that's all going on in the midst of sectional tension, Civil War, just craziness going on.
And that's exactly, I think you kind of hit on the point of what CWGK does really well, is that while the war happens and it's a seminal moment in American history, and for Kentucky, right, it reshapes in the South, it reshapes what the nation looks like for the North as well, but life still goes on, right? So that's plenty of the petitions, the documents that show up, right? Like Wadlington's case takes on this hint of the Civil War, right? He kills Milton Cartwright in 1860, but as the war begins, the letters to McGoffin in 1861 are talking about how he's a true and loyal Unionist. Wadlington's been in jail the entire time. How do we actually have an informed opinion? We can talk, like, you could talk deeper about like what that actually means about the petition writing process, but the war impacts things that are going on for individuals, but they're still interested. People are still interested in Wadlington's case, right, of getting him out of jail while the war is going on. It takes on the flavor of the war, but life is still happening, and I think that's a really salient point that you mentioned there.
It kind of reminds me in an odd way of like War and Peace, where you have all these, all of a sudden there's this focus on Napoleon, and it's here's Napoleon, here's armies, and here's battles, but it just switches, and all of a sudden it's, oh, here's just people living their life, courtship, family squabbles, inheritance, all these different issues that are just going on at home, and completely
drunken brawls in the streets of Lexington or Louisville, right, that are taking place during the war.
I think that was the thing I've really enjoyed about using CWGK and the sources. It's just that ordinary random stuff that goes down, soldiers playing pranks and just doing random stuff that you're like, oh yeah, this does go down at this time. Can you give us a bit of a behind the scenes look though? How do you all compile documents and transcribe them at CWGK? Is it just going through governor's papers, or how do you sort of start that process, and how do you get these documents that Kevin's using to build out his article?
Yeah, so I think it's important to note, right, that this work began in 2012. Like, basically, as I'm beginning my graduate journey at West Virginia in 2012, people here at KHS have started building this project for the 150th anniversary of the Civil War. So they did national searches, reaching out to people across the country, national archives, and also reaching out to people across the state. The focus is anything that crosses the desks of the governors. So this includes their responsibilities organizing the military, dealing with social concerns. So the documents that are up now, about half of what will be the edition, are predominantly petitions. These are seen, right, or were seen as like the juiciest tidbits. These are the things that are going to have the story of Wadlington. These are the things that are going to have the story of Wesley or Jane that Danielle talks about, or Garrus and the individuals that show up in Rachel, right? All of the things that show up in this special edition come from these petitions. But there's also a lot of bureaucratic documents. We're right now transcribing some of the documents that remain that connect to... So a lot of the stuff we uploaded were from the governor's files at the Kentucky Department for Library and Archives, KDLA. There are also records from the Filson Historical Society, which deal with the Provisional Confederate Government in Bowling Green. We have a lot of stuff from the Kentucky Department of Military Affairs, so KDMA, which those records are housed at the Military History Museum, which is part of our campus here at KHS. So we're dealing with a lot of those now. These are enlistment forms, people still writing petitions to the governors asking for aid of, oh, there's guerrillas or this unit's in this county and they're being annoying and harassing local citizens, those sorts of things. And then there are also bureaucratic things like receipts, muster forms, munition disbursements, things like that, like stuff that might not be the most exciting but compiles that picture of all of the things that are going on behind. So CWGK staff started the holistic picture, right? Reaching out, figuring out what documents were in scope. So anything between Lincoln's election in 1860, pretty much anything that shows up in 1860 to the end of slavery when the 13th Amendment is ratified in December of 1865. That is the scope of what CWGK is. They went out and they digitized all those documents. They combined them into PDFs. We built a website. Now half of those documents, roughly speaking, are uploaded, and we are working on transcribing more and over the next couple of years making that push so that all of those documents are available. It's great that we have them. I can look at cool stuff behind the scenes, but it doesn't do any good if only I can look at them.
Yes.
My goal, hopefully, right, one day is that someone like yourself or Kevin could sit down and write an entire project just using CWGK. They probably should and will use other sources, but like they can do a bulk of that lifting on CWGK.
And I think they model that in some of these essays, which is really helpful. Is, okay, if you use these as your primary source, you can build really interesting stories. Which does lead to my next question, which I did want to quickly delve into. At what point in going through some of these documents do you sit there and say to yourself, okay, I think we have enough for an article or a book? Is there something about, say, the Wadlington case that makes you go, okay, I think there's a story here that needs to be told? Or is it a lot of times going down these rabbit holes and sort of figuring out, can we tell the story? Do we have enough? What's that process like?
I think the Wadlington case is good. I think the answer is a little bit of both. So sometimes it's volume, right? Like the Wadlington case on one hand, it is the biggest single thread, right? There's thousands of documents, but most of them are a petition with maybe one or two other supporting petitions that come relating to a case. So most things are only 3 or 4, maybe $5, right? Like anything that has like 10 plus documents connected to it, let alone 100 in the case of Wadlington, is rare in the edition. They're snapshots of life from across the state. So I think on one hand there is a volume for Wadlington, like, hey, there's 100 documents, like clearly this event mattered. But I think there's also this question or this, okay, this tells us something interesting. So what is this interesting thing, and what is the thread we can pull on? Right, like I know you've worked on stuff with humor that shows up in CWGK and in newspapers. So I think it's that question of, okay, there's a volume. There are hundreds of documents that deal with, like Luther Adams and his older, the first special issue talked about tippling and African Americans, right? There are hundreds of documents that connect not to one case on tippling, but there's hundreds that deal with tippling and serving enslaved individuals or running a tippling house, right? Illegally serving like liquor without a license. So even if they don't relate to one case, where do we start to see patterns? So I think it is both a volume, but it's also that kind of digging in, and when do you start to see patterns that are like, all right, this is interesting, right? Like recently I came across a document. I've been working on some stuff with Thomas Bramlett. He's one of the governors. This is where I get to do the wink and nod, right? Where I'm like, well, I don't actually care about the governors, but in this one instance I do. Bramlett is an interesting figure, right? He's an attorney before the war. He ends up enlisting in the U.S. Army, resigns, becomes a federal district judge for a very brief period of time, and then enlists in the, then becomes governor. And he shifts. You can kind of see him. He's a good bellwether for how Kentuckians respond. He's extremely pro-union, pro-slavery, and as the war goes on and destroys slavery, he pulls against the Union. He begins pushing against the Union. So I've been digging into more about Bramlett. I've been giving some talks on him, but we came across a document last week or earlier this week that showed, which I realize in the context of a podcast probably doesn't do it. Recently is probably what I should say. Recently we came across a document that highlights one of his enslaved individuals who we know goes and enlists in the 5th United States Colored Cavalry, actually is along with him earlier in the war as a servant while he's serving as the colonel of the 3rd Kentucky Volunteer Infantry Regiment. It's one document. It's one of the ones we're transcribing now. So in and of itself, it's not a terribly useful document, right? It is literally him asking for compensation, him being Bramlett, asking for compensation for himself, for food and clothing, but also for the enslaved individuals that he's brought along with him. One of them being this man Leander, who we know he references in a letter out to Stephen Burbridge in 1864 about having left without his permission, and then eventually enlists at Camp Nelson, serves in the 5th United States Colored Cavalry. So I've been working on stuff for Bramlett. Eventually, hopefully, it's going to be an article for the Register. And I think that article is shifting from, oh, here's a short bio of Bramlett, to here's a dual biography of Bramlett and Leander, his enslaved individuals, his enslaved individual. We have enough that kind of teases out something that they're clearly together. He purchases Leander in 52. They serve, air quote, they're in proximity to one another while Bramlett's in the United States Army, and then Leander eventually goes on and serves in the United States Army and gets his freedom. So what does that look like? How do we use the two of them, built out of stuff from CWGK and other sources, that tells a very vibrant story? I think I took your question and kind of ran in a slightly different direction.
That's a good way to answer it. Because I think a lot of this, for people who are coming at this from, okay, I don't know if I necessarily need to use this collection. I know for me personally, I don't even really do the Civil War, and I was amazed at the sources you had, but also the way you can get at questions from new angles, which was something I did not expect, in the sense of, okay, we know newspaper humor, and that's easy to get at. You know, just go to newspapers.com and you look at the Louisville Journal or whatever you have. To be able to see how that plays out on individual levels was really interesting to me. You can see soldiers playing jokes on each other, what they call a frolic. I mean, I know for me personally, I was like, okay, this is a different perspective that I wouldn't have had if I just looked at newspapers and just looked at what was being printed in the newspapers. So I think even for the Wadlington case, I know when we look up the story in newspapers, I mean, you could tell us more about this, but there's not a lot in newspapers. So if that's your source base, you're kind of in trouble.
Yeah, if you rely on newspapers, right, just for the Wadlington case, and this allows, I think, to kind of connect into this idea of how it'd be important to talk about how I actually came across the Wadlington case. In those annotations we'd actually done one incorrectly. Well, Wadlington eventually dies while he's in the state penitentiary, but we had originally said that he was executed in March of 61, or whenever his original date to be executed is supposed to be. This is good public history, right? This is shared authority. We have opportunities for people to comment on things on CWGK, and a descendant of Wadlington, the Wadlington family, reached out and was like, hey, based on this document, another document in your edition, he isn't executed. They're still talking about him in 1863. And so I was like, well, what else do we have on this guy? What do we have on Thomas Wadlington? And I just started digging, and I found the court case, and then I just started going through, and I'm like, wait, how many documents do we really have about that? And I'm like, wait, we have 100 documents on this individual. So I think that, right, like, again, if you look at just the newspapers, all it says is there's this violent affair, an enslaved individual was arrested, Wadlington and his son are arrested, and then he's tried, and like you get these snippets, and there's sort of some like, oh my God, there was this huge bloody affair, and he brutally murdered Cartwright, and that's about it. The evidence, right, from his wife, from the court testimony, certainly suggests that there's acrimony. I know Kevin Wright, I think in his talk, very says clearly that there's this question of who shot first.
Yes.
He comes very hard down on the fact that Cartwright shot first. I think I believe that, right? Cartwright has a concealed pistol. Wadlington has a shotgun out open. Wadlington shot in the leg. I find it highly unlikely that, like, if Wadlington shot first, Cartwright's drawing a concealed pistol and shooting him in the leg with having been shot in the chest by a shotgun. I don't have science to back that up, but that's sort of where I fall on that. But in my ramblings, there's more context that comes from the documents in places you would not expect that open up this broader story.
Because I do think a lot of us, and I know we both do 19th century history, so we're familiar with this, but I think for a lot of us, we think, oh, it's just probably the newspapers. You know, there must be a court case, or you could just, nowadays, you just watch a documentary, and you're sort of, okay, this is what happens in this case, but you just have snippets, so it's it's a lot different. With that being said, I do want to bring this to a close, but I did want to give you an opportunity as we wrap up this interview. We've done 2 special issues over the years in the Register using scholarship from CWGK, 2 sort of specialized special issues on that. In the next couple of years, where do you hope to see this project go? Are there any particular stories or even broader topics that you do hope more scholars will tackle as they use CWGK as a resource?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it comes at a good time for us on CWGK. We are in the process of doing what I'm calling an audit, more broadly, like how do we take a project that is now over a decade old and improve it. I think there are a couple of things, right? Improving educational resources. How do we, for elementary and secondary ed teachers, how do we make resources more available that are useful to them? How do we provide better interpretation? As I said jokingly earlier, right? Like I want someone like Kevin to come to the project and be able to do an article, a dissertation, a book without having to leave it. That's ambitious, but how do we build an interpretive infrastructure to allow people to understand Kentucky on the ground without having to hop off of the website to Google, oh, well, what does this event mean? Or what is this word like? How can we provide that access? And I think a broader thing that we need to think about is this project gestures towards what happens in Reconstruction, what happens after the Civil War. It goes up to the end of 1865, so it hits the beginning of that, the dissolution of slavery in Kentucky. But there was a lot of stuff, I think Kentucky is instructive in this, of what happens afterwards. What about violence? What about the integration of African Americans into Kentucky, into civic society? As a slave state that was pro-union, Kentucky doesn't experience Reconstruction or the occupation that comes with Reconstruction that the Confederate states do. But it still sees those same tensions. And there are other projects, right? The Civil War and Reconstruction governors of Mississippi and Alabama, 2 other projects that have followed CWGK or are in the process of following CWGK, and they both explicitly target Reconstruction. We need to find a way interpretively to either expand the edition, because what we need is more documents to be included, right? Like this, really 20,000 isn't enough. We need 30, 40. No, that somewhat of a joke, but we do need to tackle Reconstruction, and we need to do it in a responsible way that gets people to think about how Kentucky, the state that kind of forecasts a lot of the things that come in Reconstruction, violence, resistance to federal intervention, a shifting memory of the war. These things happen in Kentucky as they happen in other parts of the South, and I think we need to tackle that, and that includes bringing us into Reconstruction at some point. Anyone who's listening, that doesn't mean it's coming like tomorrow, but it is definitely one of those things right in the future that we want to see. I think that would be my pithy kind of like, this is what I hope we add.
Well, it's great to hear that it still has ground to cover, because for historians that means, we can keep getting more and more documents as we go. I know expanding out is something that would be really awesome for a lot of us, especially Reconstruction doesn't get covered quite as much. So that would be nice if on the Register side of things, if we kept getting articles
we're here to help.
On Reconstruction and some of those topics that tend to get overlooked. Well, thank you so much for being with us today. I know this helped sort of flesh out Kevin's story a little bit more, and it gives our listeners a good backstory as to what the CWGK does and the great work that Chuck is doing with his team over there.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Through the CWGK, Dr. Welsko and his staff help to make Kentucky history available to researchers around the world. By transcribing and publishing an array of documents, the CWGK enables researchers like Kevin to explore new angles of Kentucky's rich history. We hope that you will read Kevin's article and check out the Summer-Autumn 2022 edition of the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society. This special issue is comprised of articles written by graduate research assistants who have worked at CWGK. It includes a special guest introduction by Dr. Welsko. I would like to thank Dr. Charles Welsko for his work with the Civil War governors of Kentucky and for connecting the Kentucky Historical Society to young scholars like Dr. Kevin McPartland. If you have not listened to my interview with Kevin, be sure to listen to episode 9. Kentucky Chronicles is presented by the Kentucky Historical Society with support from the Kentucky Historical Society Foundation. Our show is recorded and edited by Gregory Hardison. Thanks to Dr. Stephanie Lang for your support and guidance. Our theme music is used courtesy of Pixabay. To learn more about our publication of the Register, or to learn more about our Research Fellows program, please visit our website, history.ky.gov. To learn more about the Civil War Governors of Kentucky Digital Documentary Edition, visit their website, civilwargovernors.org. If you have enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe. If you have questions or suggestions for future podcasts, let us know on our social media accounts. It really helps us to know how we are doing. You can also help us build a following by telling your friends to subscribe.